subject to amendment over the past couple of days. More amendments and possible votes are expected today. And now live to the Senate floor here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. Chaplain Dr. Barry Black will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Lord, the earth belongs to you, the world and everything in it. You are an awesome and majestic God. When we have anxieties about what the future holds, remind us that the hearts of kings, queens, and presidents are in your hands, and you guide them wherever you please. You are sovereign. Today, bless our lawmakers. Give them a positive attitude regarding the challenges they face. Lord, help them believe that you guard this nation and will empower them with exactly what they need to lead with excellence. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Black. Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., February 1st, 2012. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Richard J. Durbin, a senator from the state of Illinois, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
the presiding officer and all senators should understand we have a new sheriff in the Senate now. And we wish Elizabeth McDonough well. She's certainly well qualified for this job, and she's proven in a decade that she's been here of her fairness and astuteness of Senate rules. So, but everyone understand, new boss in the Senate now. Mr. President, this morning, following in leader remarks, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for an hour. Republicans will control the first half. Majority will control the final half. Following that morning business, we'll resume consideration of the Stock Act. Mr. President, it's my understanding the Republicans are going to have a luncheon today. I hope they discuss what they want to do here on the Senate floor. Last night we had a situation where two of our fine senators, Senator Lieberman and Senator Collins, they have a reputation of being fair and bipartisan, and they did their best to work through some amendments to set up votes on them. And they couldn't do it because we had senators who offered amendments that had nothing to do with this bill, nothing. But they, Republican senators, said that they would not allow a vote on germane and relevant amendments until they got a vote, they were guaranteed a vote on their non-germane amendments. So that's not a good situation, and we cannot legislate in that fashion. It's one thing to offer an amendment that's not germane, but to demand a vote on it out of order before any other amendments. So the minority has to make a decision whether they want to legislate or have morning business and have people give speeches all day that have nothing to do with morning business. I mean, have nothing to do with legislation. So I hope that the leadership and the senators generally on the other side of the aisle will work together to help us move this piece of legislation out of here. It's an important piece of legislation. We were told it was bipartisan. Only 2 senators voted against breaking the filibuster so we could start debating this. Finally, Mr. President, Republicans in Congress claim often that they are the only thing standing against a wave of deficit spending. But where were these Republicans when President Bush pushed for trillions, plural, trillions, in unpaid tax cuts for the rich? Where were they? They were right here in Congress. That's where. So instead of pointing the finger at us, Republicans should examine their own track record of extravagant spending. A prescription drug plan, unpaid for. 2 unpaid wars, unpaid for, I repeat. Tax breaks for the rich, unpaid for. And they were paid for borrowed money, money borrowed from the American taxpayers. Trillions of dollars. In fact, President Bush's tax cuts were the single largest contributor to ballooning budget deficits during his administration. And there were plenty of others, but that was number 1. And no one benefited from these tax breaks more than billionaires and millionaires. Tax breaks for the richest Americans piled nearly $1 trillion on our debt over the last decade. The tax bill was far more than that, but that's just people making more than $1 million a year. Yesterday, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office released a report showing these tax cuts will continue to push deficits to unsafe levels. We know that, Mr. President. But in addition to doing that, what it does is make the poor poorer, the rich richer, and squeezing the middle class every day. Extending the Bush tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, people making more than $1 million a year, would add another $1 trillion to the deficit over the next decade. We can no longer afford to bankrupt our nation to give more tax breaks to people who don't need them. People are putting up accounts in the Cayman Islands and stashing money in Switzerland. Republicans are right about one thing. We do have a deficit problem in this country, and there are 2 ways to ease this crisis. We could cut more jobs for teachers, firefighters and police, and federal employees. We could cut Social Security and Medicare benefits for seniors after a lifetime of hard work. We could put off repairing our crumbling roads, bridges, and schools. And we could continue to let our schools fall into disrepair and our students fall far behind. And we could continue talking about things that really don't matter. Mr. President, the House keeps talking about bills that they've passed that create jobs. Everyone, every pundit that's looked at those know that it's just a subterfuge. They want to cut regulations that would make people sicker. It would make our air dirtier and our water less pure and our food less safe. That's what they're doing to create jobs. The other thing we could do to end wasteful, to cut spending, would be to take care of those unnecessary tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires. So this is the choice we faced. Cutting the heart out of America, or having the richest of the rich contribute just a little bit to the problems that we have in America today as it relates to spending. The choice we face shouldn't be a very difficult choice. This country has limited resources, and we must use those resources wisely. Investing in the middle class is a wise use of those resources. When you put money back in the pockets of the middle class, they spend it. They spend it on groceries and gas, buying new cars, paying their mortgages, paying their rent. They may be repairing their family car or spending it to fix the roof on their house that's become dilapidated. That spending boosts business, spurs hiring, and helps the economy. Rigging the tax system to favor the richest of the rich doesn't do that. Rigging the system doesn't create jobs, it doesn't spur growth, and it's not a wise use of our resources.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
Later this morning, President Obama is scheduled to speak in Virginia on the economy. I haven't seen the speech, but I expect he won't be talking about the negative impact his health care bill is already having on job creation. And I guarantee he won't be talking about one provision in particular, the Class Act, which the House of Representatives is voting to repeal today. Like so many of his policies, the Class Act hadn't turned out the way the American people were told it would. At the time of its passage, Americans were told it would be a long-term care cost saver. Proponents of the Class Act said it would account for nearly half the deficit reduction they claimed the health care bill would somehow miraculously bring about. More recently, however, the administration has admitted that government officials knew its projections about the Class Act couldn't possibly be true. They knew it wouldn't work as advertised. And yet the Obama administration went ahead with it anyway. In 2009, the chief Medicare actuary wrote that based on his 36 years of actuarial experience, he believed the Class Act would, quote, collapse in short order and require significant federal subsidies to continue, and that it would lead to what he called an insurance death spiral, since only the sickest people would sign up, making it impossible for the program to remain solvent. Another health care policy official said the program, quote, seemed like a recipe for disaster, end quote. So last October, the Obama administration was finally forced to admit what they refused to admit when the health care bill first passed, that the Class Act was indeed unsustainable. As HHS Secretary Sebelius put it, there is no viable path forward for the program. Yet for some reason, the President is unwilling to follow through on that conclusion by his own administration. He opposes today's vote over in the House. Most people would conclude that the administration would support repealing a portion of the health care bill that they now acknowledge isn't financially viable. But they'd be wrong. Despite admitting this program is doomed to fail, the Obama administration refuses to take it off the books. This refusal is all the more remarkable given the fact that President Obama has repeatedly said that he's willing to listen to critics of his health care bill if they come up with ways to improve it. When it comes to the Class Act, the President doesn't even appear willing to listen to himself. Well, it should be obvious what's going on here. The President is so determined to distract people from his own legislative record that he doesn't even want to have a conversation about it. He's so determined to convince people that the ongoing economic crisis is somebody else's fault that he's acting as though the first 3 years of his presidency never even happened. He refuses to admit the central role his policies have played in prolonging the economic mess that we're in. Instead of leading, the President is biding his time, hoping the public will blame somebody else for the jobs crisis. Instead of acknowledging the effects of his own policies, he's hoping he can change the subject. The problem is, the longer we wait to tackle these problems, the harder they'll be to solve. And frankly, most Americans think the President should be leading that charge, not avoiding it. In 2009, President Obama said that rising health care costs were the most pressing fiscal challenge we faced as a nation. Yesterday, the Congressional Budget Office said government health care costs will double over the next decade. So the verdict is in. The administration looked at an area that both parties agree was in critical need of reform, and they made it worse. And now they won't even admit it. Why? Because it interferes with the President's reelection strategy. If it's about him or his policies, he doesn't want to talk about it. And when it comes to the Class Act, it's easy to see why. So I would encourage our friends over in the House in their efforts today. I hope they send this bill over to the Senate with a strong bipartisan vote. If the President won't listen to his own advisors, let's hope he listens to Congress on the failures of his health care bill, and in particular, the failures of the Class Act. If we're going to replace the President's health care bill with the kind of common-sense reforms the American people really want, repealing the Class Act is a good place to start. And as the House is showing today, if the President refuses to act on this important issue, Congress will. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, there will now be a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first half and the majority controlling the final half. The senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that I be able to enter into a colloquy with my colleagues from North Dakota and Nebraska.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, the President of the United States says that every morning when he gets up, he thinks about what he can do to create jobs. And yet, just in the last couple of weeks, he turned thumbs down on a project that would create 20,000 shovel-ready jobs. The Keystone XL pipeline is a project that is teed up and ready to go. It would invest $7 billion initially, create 20,000 jobs immediately, and addressing a really important issue for this country, and that is energy security. We all get up and talk about getting away from the dangerous dependence that we have on foreign sources of energy, becoming more energy independent, and yet here we have an opportunity to do just that. And at the same time, create lots of economic activity here in this country, create lots of jobs, and get people in this country back to work. And so it's a mystery to many of us as to why the administration and the President would not find this particular project to be in America's national interest. It really comes down, in many respects, to whether or not we are going to continue to import the oil, the energy that we need in this country from unfriendly nations. We get about 700,000 barrels a day from Venezuela, or whether we're going to get that same 700,000 barrels of oil from a friendly neighbor like Canada. And so when you look at that juxtaposition, that comparison, and say, okay, 700,000 barrels of oil from Hugo Chavez or 700,000 barrels of oil from Canada, I think most Americans would say it makes a lot more sense to do business with a friendly ally to the north. And then also to have that come down into this country, a 1,700-mile pipeline which would transport that oil to refineries here in the United States where it would be refined and create jobs there as well. It is in almost all respects, Mr. President, as you look at the project and the attributes that come with it, the job creation, the investment, the energy security, not to mention the state and local tax revenue, which is something that's important to a lot of the people that I represent in South Dakota. In fact, I had someone from western South Dakota in my office last week, and he said, yeah, we care about the energy security issue, the jobs issue and all that, but we really need for our school districts and county governments the tax revenue that would be generated by this. And so you've got all these positives, all these benefits associated with this particular project, and yet after having studied it for over 3 years, over 1,200 days now, done multiple environmental impact statements, the last one concluded in August of last year, then lo and behold, the President decides that he's not going to move forward with his project. We think that is terribly unfortunate and not in the national interest. We believe it is in the national interest for the project to move forward to address the important energy security needs as well as the needs for job creation and economic growth in this country. And two of my colleagues, the governor, former governors, now senators from Nebraska and North Dakota, are people who are well acquainted with these types of projects. The governor of North Dakota was very involved when the first Keystone pipeline was built from Canada down through North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and points south. And that project went through a permitting process. It was a couple of years in the making. It was approved. The construction process was concluded. Now it's operational. Well, that is, I think, an example of how this particular project could work. The senator from Nebraska, of course, this would cross his state. There were some concerns at one time about whether or not it had the right route in order for this to be done in the best environmental way. Those issues have been addressed. The Nebraska legislature met in special session. The legislature and the governor of Nebraska came up with an alternative idea about how to do this, and they have been very supportive of moving forward with this project as well. So the question before the House, Mr. President, is if the President of the United States determines that this is not in the national interest, notwithstanding the support of lots of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, I think overwhelming support of the states through which this line would traverse. The labor unions who represent the working people in this country are very much supportive of this. And interestingly enough, many of the editorial pages across this country, including the Chicago Tribune, who said, and I quote, "Obama's decision will cost the United States jobs. He seems to think those jobs will still be there when he gets around to making a decision on the pipeline. But they may be, well, gone for good." End quote. And then they go on to say that this will deny the United States a reliable source of oil. Note that Canada has never threatened to block the Strait of Hormuz, end quote. So they recognize the importance of this project in doing business with a friendly country, the importance of energy independence, and the fact that if we don't benefit from this, it will go somewhere else. They've made it abundantly clear that this is not something that if the United States turns down, they're just going to continue to wait around until some point in the future when we might consider it. They're going to go somewhere else with it, probably China. So for all those reasons, we believe that we need to advance this project and do everything we can to move it forward. So my colleagues have come up with a piece of legislation that recognizes the role of the Congress under the Commerce Clause and our ability to approve this project, and I would hope that we would get an opportunity to discuss and debate this issue here in the United States Senate, to get a vote on this, perhaps get a vote as well in the House of Representatives where Congress could weigh in on this, perhaps change the President's mind about this important project. And so I'm glad to be with my colleagues today. I want to yield to the Senator from North Dakota and the Senator from Nebraska, both of whom have been great leaders on this particular issue and on all issues that relate to energy security in our country, because they understand very well both the history of this as well as its importance to America's future. And so I would ask the Senator from North Dakota if he'd like to give us a little bit of an insight about how this, the Keystone XL Pipeline #1, which was built through his state a few years ago, the history of that and the history of how this particular project was put forward as well, and why we think it ought to go forward.
I'd like to thank
The Senator from North Dakota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank the Senator from South Dakota for organizing this colloquy, and also I'd like to thank the good Senator from Nebraska for joining us as well. Appreciate working with them on this project, which is not only vital to our state, but vital to our country. And as the Senator from South Dakota said, this project is critically important to our country for a number of reasons. First, it will create tens of thousands of jobs, a $7 billion investment, not one penny of federal government spending, all private sector investment, more than $7 billion. The Perryman Group projected, when they did a study on the job creation, that it would create 20,000 construction jobs right away. And it would create upwards of 100,000 spin-off jobs as you expand refineries and with the other economic activity that's created. Some want to dispute those job numbers, but any way you look at it, you're talking tens of thousands of jobs created by the private sector, which is why it has such strong union support, at a time when we have 13+ million people out of work and we need the jobs. As the good Senator from South Dakota said, it will generate hundreds of millions in tax revenues from a growing economy, from more economic activity. Last I checked, that's pretty important at the local, state, and federal level to have those revenues coming in. In addition, it will reduce our dependence on oil from the Middle East. With what's going on in Iran, and they're threatening to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, with gas prices at $3.50 a gallon roughly going up, it's very important to the consumers and the business of this country that we have oil that we produce in this country and from our closest ally, Canada, rather than relying on the Middle East. And the third point, this oil will be produced. If we don't build the pipeline capacity to bring it to our refineries to be refined, it goes to China. That's a fact. It will be produced. It will either go to China or it will come to us. I've got this chart here, and to give you a little history of the project, because as a good senator from South Dakota said, this project has been under review for more than 3 years. TransCanada, the company that's trying to build the pipeline, built the Keystone pipeline already. That's this red line. That project was approved in 2 years. Again, Keystone XL has been under study for more than 3 years. The sister pipeline has already been built, and that was approved in 2 years. Comes from Alberta, Canada, down to the refineries in the Pawtucket, Illinois area. This project, again, well, let me back up for just a minute. The existing project, as you can see, comes through North Dakota, which is why I worked with it when I was governor of North Dakota. It comes through South Dakota, and it comes down through Nebraska. The Keystone XL comes just to the west. I point that out because for the Bakken oil play in North Dakota and Montana, it is very important that we have the ability to put oil into this pipeline. We're looking at putting 100,000 barrels a day of United States crude into this pipeline so it can get to our refineries. In other words, it's not just about bringing Canadian crude to our refineries, it's about bringing our own crude to our refineries. Why is that important? It saves wear and tear on our roads. It's an important safety issue because it reduces the truck traffic. We're talking 500 truckloads a day, 17 million truck miles a year that we don't have to put on our roads. We don't have to have the traffic issues, the safety issues, or the road issues in our country because we have the ability to move the product with this pipeline. So let's just take a quick look at this timeline. September 2008. I know this is hard to read, but I want to make an important point here. September 2008, TransCanada applies for a permit for the Keystone XL pipeline. In November of 2008, the current administration is elected. So for the entire time that the current administration has been in office, they've held up this project. It's gone through the full NEPA process. They've had the full environmental impact studies done. Even the State Department said that there would be a decision before the end of last year. So for the entire time that the administration is in office, TransCanada is working to go through the process with EPA and the Department of State, and the Department of State says they'll have a decision before the end of last year. But we still don't have a decision. You have to ask why. Why don't we have a decision? And that's what we're talking about. It is long past time to act. Let's just take a look. What are we talking about, really? Let's get down to what we're really talking about. We're talking about another pipeline, aren't we? We're talking about another pipeline, just like the one that's already been built. And how about the hundreds, or maybe I should say thousands of pipelines that we already have? But somehow we can't build this pipeline? It doesn't make any sense. Somebody needs to explain this to us. So we have legislation with 45 senators, 45 sponsors that are saying, hey, it's time to move forward. It's time to build the project. And as a matter of fact, we're doing everything we can. We are doing everything we can to address any and all problems or concerns the administration has raised. And that's why I'm going to turn it over now to my good colleague from Nebraska, because when the administration says, hey, there's an issue, when state or EPA says, hey, there's an issue, we have stepped up in our legislation and we've solved it. And we said, hey, okay, great, let's address it. But let's move forward for the good of our economy and the good of our country. I would defer now to the good senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the comments that have been offered by my colleagues from South Dakota and from North Dakota. And they absolutely have it right in terms of the importance of constructing this pipeline. There is no question that we are in a dire situation in this nation. We need the jobs, we need the oil, and this pipeline can take a significant step forward in both regards. I think the pipeline will be a huge help in those areas. But let me start by noting that I was a co-sponsor of the first Keystone bill. I'm also a co-sponsor of the bill that Senators Hoeven and Lugar and Vitter introduced just this past Monday, the bill that we're talking about today. Now, here's a very important point for my state. In both cases, and specifically in reference to this bill, the effort was specifically crafted to safeguard the route selection process that is occurring in Nebraska. And I thank my colleagues for recognizing that work and recognizing that Nebraska has a process that will near completion this August or September. They have worked very, very hard to take into account our issues, and their bill recognizes the Nebraska effort will continue. They decided in our state, the governor and the legislature, and TransCanada, to work on an alternative to the proposed route. Recognition occurred that the route through Nebraska involves some very, very sensitive land, the sandhills, and a very, very sensitive water supply, the Ogallala Aquifer. Well, the governor called a special session, and like we do in Nebraska, everybody sat down and said, how do we solve this problem? So they came to agreement that the best way to solve the problem was to do an environmental impact statement, which will be no cost to the federal government. It will be paid for by Nebraskans. That was part of the provision of this agreement. And TransCanada agreed that they would work to reroute the pipeline through our state. Everybody shook hands. We are now in agreement. Our problem is solved in Nebraska. For months and months, the federal government has been saying to the state of Nebraska, you have the power to route this pipeline through your state. And that's exactly what we are doing. So this legislation recognizes that agreement and says, great, we're going to allow Nebraska to move forward. But very wisely, this legislation also recognizes that there is no need whatsoever for any delay on the remainder of this pipeline. This was the only segment, and it's a handful of miles in our state, that anybody was really contesting. So why not issue the permit? Why not get the project going? Well, my colleagues worked very hard on coming up with a solution, and their solution works. And it says construction can begin immediately. Why? Because as my colleague from North Dakota has explained well, Congress has constitutional authority to regulate foreign commerce. So the bill exercises that power in a thoughtful, deliberate, careful way. It says, look, this project has gone through 3 years of study and analysis. It specifically notes in this legislation that the part in Nebraska will be solved, as the federal government has been saying for months, by Nebraska officials, but that we can go forward and start construction elsewhere. So what's holding up the creation of these jobs? What's holding up our ability to get more oil from places like North Dakota and a friendly ally like Canada versus a very unfriendly ally in Hugo Chavez in Venezuela? What's holding that up? What could possibly be holding that up? Well, the simple answer to that question is the President of the United States is holding it up. He's in a bind. The environmentalists have declared war on the oil sands in Canada. They don't want the pipeline because they don't want the oil sands. On the other hand, the unions want to build the pipeline. They want the jobs. Thoughtfully so. Well, this is a time where Congress does need to step in and exercise our constitutional powers. It is nothing unusual. In fact, there was a recent opinion by the Congressional Research Service that said you have the power to do exactly what this legislation is doing. So I'll wrap up my comments today and defer or yield the time back to the senator from South Dakota and North Dakota and just say this. This is a win-win situation for everybody. It's a win because we create jobs. It's a win for our country that is trying in every way possible to get the federal government to lessen our dependence on foreign oil. Now, maybe the only person that's not a win for is President Obama in his re-election. But this is a case where we need to put national interest ahead of November. And I urge my colleagues to support this legislation that was thoughtfully crafted. It is the right approach, and I thank them for their sensitivity to the process going on in the state of Nebraska.
I appreciate the Senator from Nebraska's hard work on this subject as well, and the Senator from North Dakota and he have fashioned a solution which I think does give us an opportunity as the Congress to assert our role under the Constitution, under the Commerce Clause in the Constitution, to move this project forward, notwithstanding the opposition, really, of one person, the President of the United States, who is the person right now who's standing in the way of this. And I would just again say to my colleague from North Dakota as we wrap up here that, you know, I hear people say this needs to be studied further. You know, we need to do more analysis. And it just is sort of mind-boggling to think that after more than 1,200 days of study, analysis, review, scrutiny, that people would come to that conclusion. The Keystone XL Pipeline 1, which the Senator from North Dakota is well acquainted with because it goes through his state and he was involved in negotiating that project, took 693 days in the process of getting approved. And what's interesting to me about this particular project is 1,200 days longer than any of the pipelines this magnitude, extended review, more than 10,000 pages of environmental analysis concluded that the pipeline will not adversely impact the environment. And when the announcement was made to deny the construction of the pipeline, the State Department still had 5 weeks to review it if they'd chosen to use it. Clearly, the announcement wasn't based on policy, but on political expediency, which is what the Senator from Nebraska has just pointed out. And so, you know, my colleague from North Dakota, who there is tremendous amount of resource in his state, I think could benefit as well from this. You are, I think, generating or have the potential to generate somewhere on the order of 500,000 barrels of oil in North Dakota, about 100,000 of which I'm told could be moved through this pipeline if it's approved. And it just seems to me, at least, again, here's a resource, an energy reserve in our country, in your state, that could benefit people in this country. And by the way, in 2011, Americans spent more on gasoline than any other year since 1981. And reports indicate that 2012 could be even worse. And so when you look about the economic impact of this on Americans from us not having our own energy coming into this country or produced in this country, that's a very real impact. In fact, since the President's taken office, the gas price has gone from $1.84 a gallon to over $3.30 a gallon. And this pipeline could be part of that solution. I want to just end by a quote that the State Department in their review of the pipeline made. The Department of Energy, I should say, but it was part of the State Department's review. But the Department of Energy noted, and I quote, "Gasoline prices in all markets served by East Coast and Gulf Coast refineries would decrease, including the Midwest," end quote. That's coming from the State Department's review, the Department of Energy. Gasoline prices in all markets served by East Coast and Gulf Coast refineries would decrease. I mean, that's a pretty remarkable economic impact, not to mention all the jobs that would be associated with the construction of this, and once it's operational, the jobs that would be created in this country in refining this oil. And so, again, it is a win-win. It's one, as you heard from the Senator from Nebraska, who initially their state had some concerns about the route, been resolved. This thing can move forward. The Senator from North Dakota's legislation, which I'm proud to support and co-sponsor, I hope gets a vote here in the United States Senate. And I know you're going to do everything you can to advance it. I hope you will, and I look forward to working with you.
I'd like to thank my colleague from South Dakota again for organizing this colloquy this morning. I'd like to thank both him and the esteemed Senator from Nebraska for their support of this legislation. Again, we have taken a problem-solving approach to this legislation. We're continuing to do that. And so we will continue to work with the other members of the Senate and our colleagues in the House. We need the administration to engage with us on this important issue for the good of the American people. Again, thanks to my colleague from South Dakota.
President, with that, we yield back the balance of our time.
Senator from South Dakota yields back the balance of his time.
That the Senate be in a quorum call.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
we are.
May I ask that the quorum call be lifted?
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We are in an age of tight budgets and of tough choices, and I rise today to introduce legislation that would address some loopholes in the tax codes which provide for super high income Americans ways to pay lower tax rates than are paid by regular, hardworking, middle-class families. These middle-class families feel that they are struggling to get by, and then they find out that some people with really extremely high incomes are actually paying a lower all-in federal tax rate than they are. That's, to them, just not common sense, and that's, I think, to all of us, just not common sense. Americans deserve a straight deal, and right now they are not getting one from our tax system. To see the unfairness of our current tax system, we don't have to look much farther than the national headlines. According to a Forbes magazine report last fall, billionaire Warren Buffett, and I quote, paid just 11.06% of his adjusted gross income in federal income taxes in 2010. Mr. Buffett is the first to express his dismay at this circumstance and acknowledges that the rate he pays is lower than the tax rate paid by his own secretary. Mr. Buffett has called for a correction of this anomaly, and I agree with him. And so does President Obama, who in his State of the Union address said that Washington should stop subsidizing millionaires. I agree. We should celebrate the success of people who are earning $1 million and more a year, but we really don't, particularly in this time of tight budgets and hard choices, need to subsidize that. The legislation that I've introduced today, the Paying a Fair Share Act of 2012, would ensure that those with extremely high incomes pay at least a minimum federal tax rate of 30%. I want to thank Senators Akaka, Begich, Leahy, Harkin, Blumenthal, and Sanders for being initial co-sponsors of this measure. The structure of our bill is pretty simple. If your total income, capital gains included, is over $1 million, you calculate your taxes under the regular system. If your effective tax rate turns out to be greater than 30%, you pay that rate. If, on the other hand, your effective tax rate is under 30%, like Warren Buffett's 11%, then you'd pay the fair share tax rate. After collecting input from some of my colleagues, I've also included a provision to allow the fair share tax to be gradually phased in for taxpayers earning between $1 and $2 million per year. Taxpayers earning less than $1 million, which is 99.9% of all Americans, wouldn't be affected by this bill at all. Taxpayers earning over $2 million would be subject to the 30% minimum federal tax rate, and those in between $1 million and $2 million would pay on a phased-in basis a portion of the extra tax required to get up to the 30% effective tax rate. This way, we make sure that no taxpayer faces a tax cliff where earning an additional dollar of income increases his or her taxes by more than $1. In his State of the Union address on Tuesday, President Obama called for legislation to ensure that the highest earning taxpayers pay at least a 30% tax rate. The Fair Share Act would do just that. To call our tax system fair, I believe the highest income Americans should pay a higher rate, not a lower one, than middle income taxpayers. For more context, let's take a look again, because I have given this speech over and over again on the floor, at how super high income taxpayers fare under our current system. This is the Helmsley building in New York, as I've pointed out before. It's on Park Avenue, and it has a unique characteristic, which is that it is so big it has its own zip code. So because the Internal Revenue Service publishes information about tax payments by zip code, you can see what the tax payments are that come out of this building. And what we find out with the latest information that the IRS has published is that the average filer has an adjusted gross income of over $1 million in the Helmsley building, but the average tax payment out of that building is only 14.7%. To provide a little context for that, if you look at what the average New York City janitor or the average New York City security guard pays in terms of an effective all-in federal tax rate, it's 23.8% for the security guard and 24.9% for the janitor. So at this point, it looks like the people who are the very successful occupants of the Helmsley building pay an actual lower federal tax rate than the people who come in and clean the building, and that does not seem fair or sensible. And one might say, well, maybe it's just, you know, something about the Helmsley building that causes it, but it's not, despite Leona Helmsley's infamous line that it's only the little people who pay the taxes. It's a broader issue than that. Take a look at the income tax information about the highest earning 400 Americans. In the same way that the IRS aggregates information by zip code, it also takes the 400 highest income earners and reports on them in aggregate. The 400 top incomes for 2008, which is the last year the IRS has assembled, they had an average income each of $270 million, which certainly is something to be proud of and to celebrate if you can achieve that kind of success. But the average tax rate paid by the 400 was only 18.2%, which is considerably apart from the discussions we've been having in the Senate about what the top income tax rate should be. We discuss often whether the top income tax rate should be 35% or should be 39.6%. It was 39.6%, for instance, during the booming Clinton economy. It's now 35%. Depending on where the tax cut discussion goes, it may go back up again. But that really is not what a large number of these very high income earners pay. In fact, the top 400 aren't anywhere near that. They're about half that at 18.2%. So we're supposed to have a graduated tax code with people who are progressively graduated, with people who earn more paying a higher rate. Let's see who else pays an 18.2% rate. We looked at Bureau of Labor Statistics information for a single filer earning $39,350. That's where you hit an 18.2% tax rate, just like the 400 who made $250 million each on average. They're in the same position as somebody who's earning a little less than $40,000, who pays 18.2% under our present system. And if you look at the type of jobs that hit that area, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in the Rhode Island labor market, a truck driver earns on average $40,200. So you have a truck driver paying the same rate of federal tax as somebody earning $250 million in a year. So I think there's plenty of room for correction here and to bring our tax system in line to the principle that I think we all espouse theoretically, which is that it's a progressive tax system. And the more you earn, the more you pay, and indeed the higher a rate you're supposed to pay. It's not supposed to be the other way around, where at the really high extreme you end up paying lower rates than regular Americans. So the Helmsley building was one building that has a little story to tell all of us. Here's another building with a story to tell. This is a building that is called Ugland House, and it is in the tax haven Cayman Islands. It doesn't look like much, does it? I don't want to say it's a crummy little building, but it certainly doesn't compare to a lot of other business buildings. But it does have something remarkable happening within it. It has 18,000 corporations that claim to be doing business out of this location. 18,000 corporations in this little five-story building. It gives a new meaning to the phrase small business. Well, as our budget chairman, Kent Conrad, has pointed out, the only business going on in Ugland House is funny business with our tax code. Shell companies that hide assets and dodge tax liabilities. Mr. President, it does not make sense that our tax system permits the highest income Americans to pay a lower tax rate than a truck driver pays, and it doesn't make sense that we allow Americans and American companies to, by the thousands, to hide income in offshore tax havens like this. If you look at the rates that are paid, Warren Buffett, 11.6%, the occupants of the Helmsley building on average, 14.7%, and the 400 $250 million a year earners on average, 18.2%. And you look at the fact that we have multi-trillion budget deficits, it means that the taxes they're not paying at the nominal 35% rate are taxes that somebody else ends up having to pay, either through deficit or through additional taxation. So this is why the Fair Share Act makes a lot of common sense. And I hope that senators on both sides of the aisle will take a good look at it. This bill would do a lot of good things. It would simplify taxes. There's no point chasing loopholes if you know you're going to have to pay the 30% minimum. It'll simplify that. It would discourage the exotic tax dodges that allow people to go down to 14% or whatever tax rates, because they know they're going to get caught at 30%, so why do the effort, and the exotic tax dodges will be discouraged. It will reduce the deficit. We don't have a number yet from the Joint Committee on Taxation, but the public reporting so far has suggested it's going to be in the $40 to $50 billion range per year. And of course, it will bring fairness as well as common sense to our tax system. It really makes no sense for somebody earning $80,000 or $100,000 or $120,000 a year to be paying a substantially higher tax rate than somebody earning $250 million a year. There are a lot of advantages that come with enormous income, and that's a great thing because America thrives on capitalism, and we all love success. We celebrate success in America. We provide an economy and a culture in which people can accomplish remarkable things and create enormous fortunes and become enormously successful, and that is part of what is good and what is right with America. They do it through hard work. They do it through being smarter than other people. They do it with a lot of good personal characteristics. But with all the advantages that do come with an enormous income, paying a lower tax rate than regular working families should not be one of those advantages. I hope we can get together to correct this, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on this issue, and I yield the floor. I thank you, Madam President. I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Akaka.